We are in the book of 1 Corinthians, and we concluded, and we spent a lot of time, and like I said, there's a lot of depth. Actually, this whole book, there's a lot of depth, but verses 10 through 17 last week, the last 2 weeks, we spent a lot of time in, and this is really the basis of the book. So we are dealing with a topic, and we've mentioned there's numerous problems throughout this book that that Paul's dealing with. And by the way, I probably will keep emphasizing this as I go forward. Who are the problems with, or where are the problems? Who's Paul writing to? Christians, the church, right? And when I started preaching full-time, I promised myself this was going to be an emphasis of any Bible class that I teach. So many times in our public assembly, it's been my experience at least, I'll say it that way, that people gather together and we read very difficult passages, and everyone wants to talk how everyone else in the world is violating the principles that we're reading about and having the problems that we're reading about. That's not the message of this book, either 1 Corinthians or the Bible in general. And it's only in self-application, even when it's difficult, that we have any benefit whatsoever from the words of God. So the problem we started to deal with was division. And I worked hard to illustrate the difference between division and a split. I think a lot of times when we think about divisions, we're thinking about physical splits where people go different directions. But divisions come long before that, right? And divisions are present even when we are together. And that was the case of these Corinthians. In fact, as we noted as we went through, many of them worshiping in their individual homes. They were spread out. And so that wasn't the issue, their physical location. Their issue was that they were divided. They were divided in spirit. They were divided in thought processes. They were divided into cliques. Now, as we start into 18 through the end of the chapter, 18 through 31, Paul is continuing to address this issue, and clear through chapter 2, he's still addressing the same issue. But he's getting at the crux of the matter. It would be one thing to say that what we should do is not be divided, right? And you hear that a lot. It was brought to my attention, I was reading a book here a while back that mentioned that oftentimes the reason we are so unsuccessful in modifying behavior is we're focused on outcome, not behaviors. For instance, in the book I was reading gave this example. What we say is, I want to lose weight. Well, how do you do that? Well, you eat healthier, you exercise more. These are broad principles, and we get focused on the outcome, not the behavior. So the idea was that a more effective form of addressing that, if that's the goal, instead of focusing on the outcome, is to focus on individual behaviors and mindsets. Can't that be the case in the church? It's one thing, live more godly lives. I mean, you hear that all the time, right? And sometimes we can read our Bibles as though that's what it's saying, but it's really not. It's much more fundamental than that. And that's what Paul's getting at in these verses. How is it that we live not divided as individuals and as a church? That's what he's going to address. Questions or comments on that introduction? So if I could have, and we're going to break this into 2 paragraphs, and I think Paul very much has structured the letter that way. Would someone read 18 through 25 for us? This is 1 Corinthians 1, just in case I haven't said that.
I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since, in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men.
Okay, thank you, Court. Before we start dressing, I want to say hello to Tom and Tina, who are under the weather. We're glad you're able to be with us online, though. So, Corey reads 18 through 25 for us there. And if we were to sum this up in really one short phrase, what would it be? The way we live less divided is to live more like who? Christ. Yeah. How many times in this book is Christ mentioned? A lot. Perfect. You're exactly right. 169. Yes, 169 times in this book. And that's the answer, constant. Christ. So the way we live less divided is to live more like Christ. Now, to sum up the rest of this chapter, I believe it's the idea that I mentioned last week at closing. It is that the church cannot live like the world Christianized. Or in other words, Christians cannot be a religious representation of the culture they live in. What we see in Corinth is that the Christians have put a religious twist, a Christian twist, on everything that goes on about them. Let me ask you that. We guilty of that? Is that a temptation for us today? It has to be, right? Especially because the Christian's not called to come out of the world. They're to be in the world. Now, we're not talking morally, but where are we to live? In the world. That's how we have an influence. That's how we have an impact. Plus, where we come from, our background, our culture, right? Do these things all impact us? Yeah, absolutely. It does. The way it was impacting the Corinth, and we started to introduce this idea last week, is that they had philosophers, lovers of wisdom. Sound like a bad idea? No. Let me ask you this. Has the world greatly benefited from the philosophers of this era and time in the Greek nation, including Corinth? Yeah, absolutely. We've reaped tremendous benefits. So here's how this happened a lot at that time. In Corinth and in the Greek territories as a whole. If you followed a teacher, then you oftentimes very physically and literally would follow them around the streets. But even if you were not in their presence, in the streets, you were expected to make a presentation or defense on behalf of your teacher. Now, this had impacted Judaism quite significantly. You'll remember in, I think it's Matthew 18, I should have verified that beforehand, but Jesus is asked the question, is it legal or is it right to divorce one's wife for any cause? And what we oftentimes miss is the context of where these questions are coming from, is that there were rabbis that taught one way and rabbis that taught another way, and people followed one rabbi or the other, and then they argued with each other, and no, this rabbi's right, no, my rabbi's right, no, you've got it all wrong, how can you follow that man? I mean, it sounds so much unlike us, it's hard to believe, isn't it? And if you think about what Paul has just written about, you know, one says I'm of Paul, one of Apollos, one of Cephas, another I'm of Christ. The issue and the division, as we talked about same mind last week, was actually coming from the idea that someone could be most correct and completely correct, and everyone else should be exactly like them. It's exactly what went on in the Greek tradition and their culture at that time. We're going to argue this out, and you know, here's how you have to see this. How many times have you heard the statement, well, that's already been solved? Right? Oh, that was decided years ago. Right? Righteousness based on all the right ideas and right thoughts. Now, here's what's at the core of it. Godly wisdom, godly knowledge, the Spirit of God unites, pulls together. Isn't that the message of the New Testament? What to do to the Jews and the Gentiles? Made them one. We looked a couple weeks ago, even though they were really different, even how they worshiped, right? Really different. They're one. What about male and female? Made them one. What about slave and master? Made them one. How do we get so divided in this world? By being people, right? By not being like God. What does manly wisdom do? Segregates, right? Segregates. This is what I am, what are you? Yeah, there are actually fights and arguments that take place in public right now. It's not unique to us or our time. It's just because over what someone's political views are. Right? I mean, someone wears a hat or a shirt, and man, there's confrontation in public, and it doesn't matter what side of the equation you're on. The point is there's sides, right? That's what worldly human wisdom and reasoning always does. Now, Corey did not read this for us, not because he was derelict in his duties, but because I didn't ask him to read it. Verse 17 is our transitional verse. For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel. Now, we kind of ended with dealing with that last week. Here's where we need to focus this morning because it's the transition to where we're going forward, or where Paul's going forward. What's Paul's purpose? To preach the gospel, the good news. Now, I've mentioned this before, but so many times we assign meanings based on our own experiences to words. And sometimes, usually those meanings are somewhat accurate, but we miss the original. The idea of gospel, we would say what? Means what? Good news. But culturally at this time had a greater meaning than that, right? Paul's not just saying I preached the good news. It had a cultural meaning that a new emperor, a new king has come to power, and it's good news for you because they're going to rule well. Paul is saying, I came to preach that you have a new king. There's great significance when it comes to division. Now, notice the next. And not with words of eloquent wisdom. Now, I mentioned this last week, but I didn't get to explain it much. That, so many people justify and say, well, it doesn't matter how you share the gospel. It doesn't matter how you preach. It doesn't matter how you talk to people. As long as it's the truth, that's good. That doesn't work in our marriages. We all understand that very well, right? And it doesn't work anywhere else in life. We have to understand the context of what Paul's talking about. The orators of the Greek the orators and Greek philosophers of their age were gathering tremendous followings that we just spent some time talking about, right? And they were revered and respected based on their ability to make their case and to win arguments and to win debates. And that's how they gain following. How do you know who's most right? The best debater. In a worldly sense, in a manly sense, that's the case. That was their culture. Paul says, no, that's not what my message is based on. It's based on, now this is the crazy part. We'll bring this back in a few moments. It's based on what? Not with words of eloquent wisdom, but what? It's the next phrase. Lest, or verse 17, the cross of Christ be emptied of its power. Where's the power? Christ, and in particular, the cross. What he did, and this is really important, and the cross is another one of these phrases that means something to us and we lose so much importance of it. What he did was he said, not by manly wisdom, but by the power of the cross. And there's a reason he's going to use the cross. Because it's foolishness to the world. How do you conquer by being killed? That's ridiculous. That's his point. And that's what he's going to elaborate on. Not by eloquent wisdom, not by great rhetoric, not by great debate, not by being the superior orator, but by the power of the message, the power of the cross. That's what brings us together. That's what unites us. That's what gets us all pulling the same direction. Questions or comments on verse 17 as it relates to what we've said? So verse 18 that Corey read, for the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Now, we're going to start at the end of that verse and work back to the beginning of it. The quote there is from Isaiah 29, verse 14. And Paul's point is, God always used foolishness of man as his own wisdom. In other words, God's wisdom is so far beyond what ours is that what he actually says is wise seems foolishness to us. The whole world today, praise be the God for this, the whole world today is pausing to acknowledge that God became man. Even a baby. You know what that means? This guy, you said 10 weeks old, Marissa? 10 months. That's what I meant. It's not what I said. 10 months old. Hi. It's still completely dependent upon you, isn't he? Have you ever thought about God being 100% dependent on Mary, a teenage girl, probably Evie's age? You ever think about that? That is foolishness. That's not what rulers do. That's not what kings do, right? That is Paul's point. That God, wait, let me get this straight. God has not turned the world upside down. In actuality, starting with Adam and Eve, man has turned the world upside down from what God intended it to be. That's why it seems upside down for us. It's actually right side up, right? That was Isaiah 29:14. The statement before that, and this is easy to miss, but it's very important. For the word of the cross is folly to those. Notice the difference in phraseology. Who are perishing. But to those who are being saved, it's the power of God. It's my understanding in Greek, this is even more clear. What Paul is saying, to those who are killing themselves, to those who are causing themselves to perish. It's foolishness. The cross is foolishness to those that are going down the road of destruction. But to us who are being saved, the action there is not based on the one being saved, but on God. It's wisdom. Here's what Paul's just said. Folks, wake up. He said, I said, folks, the head shot up. I'm not scolding you. You are killing yourselves because you're insisting, even though you have the cross, even though you have Christ, you are acting like you did before you had him. Quit acting like the world. Don't bring worldly wisdom into the body of Christ. You're going to get the same results there. The same way as Adam and Eve brought corrupted wisdom into the Garden of Eden. He's saying, don't do it. Questions or comments on that before I deal with the folly of the cross? This is addressed a little bit later, but the folly of the cross is incredible. I haven't got through the whole book, but there's an incredible book. I've read the first half of it 2 or 3 times, and then I don't get through it, not because it's not good, but it's entitled Evangelism in the Early Church. And then the same author, Green, wrote a book that's entitled 30 Years That Changed the World. And for me, that book, the first book, is so helpful because it takes the preaching of the apostle and puts it in New Testament context. I said the cross earlier has a meaning to us, right? I mean, people wear it. It's earrings and necklaces and all kind of different ways. No one, and I do mean no one in the first century would have wore a cross. To the Jews, it was a curse. You can go back in Deuteronomy and look. The law itself said anyone who hung on a tree is accursed. Now the Romans perfected it. Crucifixion didn't start with the Romans. They just perfected it, right? And so the Jewish mindset was it was a curse of God to be crucified. And now you're telling me my Savior, my Messiah, is died in that way? not a chance. It had very different meaning to them. What about to the Greeks? The Greeks saw crucifixion as the lowly death of rebels. You know, this is how Rome oftentimes squashed rebellions. They came in, and I can't remember, it was actually the Greeks, it was Greeks that they did it to. They crucified thousands of men and put them, or people, and put them on each side of the road. So, because the city was rebelling, and the name of the city is elude me at the moment. So Rome comes in, they squash it, and then they crucify the entire rebellious city, essentially. So when you come into this city, you're walking by all these people crucified. Crucifixion, the cross, was not a statement of victory to these people. It was the That's the context. That's what Paul is saying, the folly of the cross. My battery must have been dead, Christian. I'll stand here. Give this to you. They're giving me all kind of hand signals back there. That's how I interpreted Linda. I hope that's what they're telling me. So the folly of the cross. Here's I think the implications. Don't try and act like the world tells you to try, where you scramble to get to the top. I'm more correct. I'm more smarter. That was intentional. Not all of them are. I'm better. Right? So you ought to be more like me. God became man, and he died the most despicable death and manner of death that you can imagine to conquer the world. Quit trying to be better. Quit acting like the world. And that gets to Paul's underlying theme. Our faith in Christ, the impact of the gospel, should impact how we live. Right? Should impact who we are. Questions or comments? Powerful points, I think, and especially when you couple it to what follows that by acting this way, you're causing yourself to perish. But rather by accepting the cross, you're allowing God to save you. So 20 then, and we're going to get through 25 today, I promise that much. Not sure we'll get much further. Where is the one who is wise? Now, is Paul asking a literal question? Where is the one that's wise? Is he asking a literal question? Does he expect an answer to this? Or what's he imply by asking the question? Who do you consider being wise? That's the great conclusion to this, right? Where we're going to look. These Greek philosophers, let me ask you this, even in our fellowship today, are there speakers who are well known? You go anywhere and you mention their name and people know who they are? Paul, by saying where is the one who's wise, the fact he's asking it is implying you're not as wise as you think you are. Right? Notice the follow-up questions. Where's the scribe? Where is the debater of his age, or philosopher would be another translation there? Where are these smart people? Now, it's with great import that the categories he got here. Where is the scribe? Who does that represent? Smart people in what area? What's the scribe smart in?
The law.
The law,
Yep.
right? Yeah. The Jewish smart guy, right? Where is the debater or the philosopher of his age? Who's that referring to? The Greek, right? The philosophers that we're just talking about. Isn't that interesting? They pulls out both sides of that equation. Has not God made foolishness the wisdom of this world? He's saying your human wisdom, your human reasoning isn't going to be enough to solve these problems, because God is upside down for where we're at, where the world's at. Questions or comments on those questions in verse 20? 21, for since in the wisdom of God the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. It says, what the power of what we're preaching. Paul is being very intentional not to hold himself up, right? To the contrary. He's saying the only power that I have is in what I preach, not the way I preach it, not with all the rhetoric that I put around it. Right? Now, to have said that, this letter is masterfully put together. Paul and really all the biblical human writers were literary geniuses. At that, he's saying that's not where the power is. The power is in what we preach, to save those who believe. He's going to make the point, and tonight I hope to share this. He's making the point that those who are saved are not great, are not wonderful, are not smarter than the rest of the world. God's chosen to do the opposite, what seems like folly of the world. How do we impact the world? It's not by showing we're better. It's with humility, right? That's how Christ conquered the world. For Jews demand a sign and Greeks seek wisdom. Jerry, we finally got there. You brought that to our attention weeks ago. And the contrast there is that human wisdom, right? Contrasted with the folly of the cross. It's the exact opposite. 23, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and folly to the Gentiles. I think I explained that a little bit ago. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greek, Christ, the power of God in the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. The weakness of God, being crucified, becoming man and being crucified, was enough to conquer the entire world. It's stronger than the wisdom of man. All right, in conclusion, how is it that we become less divided? Focus on who? Oh, it's like you guys are paying attention. Thank you.